All right, Habakkuk, chapter 3. It's a doxology to God. Now, the first two chapters of Habakkuk were like a question and answer period between the prophet and God. And now that God had answered Habakkuk, the prophet prayed so as to close his book. He had been complaining about the sin that had gone unchecked in the country and was really bewildered. And he say perplexed. I guess they're one and the same words. Either way, he was shocked that God had already made arrangements for an instrument to judge Judah. And of course, that was Babylon. Chapter 3 is a culmination. It's the climax of the book. Now, there are some scholars and commentators who contend that it was written at a much later date, and also maybe by someone assuming his name or that had a similar name. But it's been determined now that the chapter is not really a postscript. It's the pinnacle of praise. It's the summit, ultimate destination that was reached on a journey that began, and I pulled the allegory from Pilgrim's Progress, beginning in the city of destruction and going through the slough of despond. So the prayer, verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to Shigionoth. Now, this verb, or this word is a verb and it's related, meaning to sway or move back and forth or to and fro. So whenever you have seen the Jews or the Hebrews praying at the Wailing Wall there in Jerusalem, you'll see how they rock from the waist forward as they pray. Some say it's sort of like an erratic song of enthusiasm or enthusiastic irregularity. But it's, from what I was reading and as I go over it, it's more of a prayer with emotion. Now, the prayer was intended for public use, and that's shown in the first verse, saying, according to Shigionoth. And then again, in the last verse, verse 19, it says that this is for the choir master with stringed instruments. Now, the second verse, he goes and he says, excuse me, Lord, I have heard the report about you and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. And in wrath, remember mercy. He began by saying that, why don't you do something, Lord? Now, this is in the first chapter. And now he's ending up saying, Lord, be careful. Don't do too much. In wrath, remember your mercy. I see that you're working, Lord, but remember that you still are a God of mercy. And in the midst of it, all that he says is that, meaning that's all that he says. Now, there's no philosophizing. There's no theology, and there's no more arguing with God. This prayer, it's beautiful, it's poetic, and it's really the most beautiful, most poetic in all the passages of the Scriptures. And as you read it, you will see how the prophet is doing nothing more or less than going back and remembering what God has done in the past. And that's what convinces Habakkuk that God can be trusted. He rests on the events that have already occurred, events that cannot be questioned and they cannot be taken away. They can't be shaken away. The great fact that God has already moved in human history is what we can rely on. And this is where the faith must rest. We don't live by blind faith. We live with a God who has acted in time and space. We live with a God who has done something, who has indelibly recorded his will in the progress of all the human events. So the prophet looks back to God's actions in Egypt when Israel was in trouble, and he remembered how God moved. Verses 3 and 4. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his power. You can remember how he hid his power from Pharaoh, and then flashed out in sudden acts of miraculous intervention. The prophet continues in verses 5 and 6. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed his heels. He stood and he measured the earth. He looked and he shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains that were there were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. He also remembered how the people of Israel were afflicted, and in the wilderness, how in the land of Midian they trembled in fear. Then he thinks of the crossing of the Red Sea and how God made a way through the waters. Then he's reminded of how the Jordan River was rolled back when they came into the land. In verse 10, the mountains you saw and quaked. The downpour of water swept by. The deep uttered forth his voice. It lifted high its hands. On through verse 11. The sun and the moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In the indignation, you marched through the earth. In anger, you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people. For the salvation of your anointed, you struck the head of the house of evil, to lay him open from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devour, who oppress in secret. You trample on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. I hear in verse 16, and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. So Habakkuk, what it does is he sees the problem. He knows that it's coming. The fearsomeness of it grips him. It gets hold of him. And it makes him tremble. He feels the pressure. But then that's not all. He finishes in verses 17 through 19. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like a deer's. He makes me tread on high places. And then he says to the choir master with stringed instruments. Now, even though these problems remain along with the pressure, there can be strengthening of the inner man that makes the heart rejoice and be glad even in the midst of any and all difficulty. And that's what Habakkuk has discovered. The Lord himself, he says, is my strength. The Lord himself is your strength. And that is the New Testament truth. And that's the great, not so secret of a Christian, of a true believer. You know, the world, it's desperately trying to find a way to get rid of the problems that we have. But God has ordained that the problems will remain. Jesus said, in the world you will have tribulation, but be in good cheer, because I have overcome the world. The sovereign Lord gives triumph over all circumstances to those who trust him, those whose faith is in him. So where does that faith come from? That we must have. It comes from him and him alone. It is that gift that he gives to all of us. So the way to get out from under the load that you may be having, whatever it may be, the way to get out from under the load that this nation is under, well, the way to get out of the load that this world is under, is to be under the Lord himself. To be under him is to be over any and all circumstances. The lessons we learn sometimes are well, the price of the book, as they say. Especially when the world itself seems like a big cesspool of quicksand. My goodness, we are. All of us are under a heavy load. And as Christians, we're going to be coming under a heavier load already in other nations. But we will be having it here. But Habakkuk was about to go under when he began the book. There was destruction, there was violence, there was strife, there was conflict, there was injustice, and there was wickedness. And that's all he could see. What do you see now? Let's just keep it amongst us within our nation. Nothing different. He cried out, but it did not go unheeded. God answered him. And God provided the confidence that he needed to lift him up from that quagmire, from that cesspool of problems. Habakkuk maybe started in the pits, but he ended up on the mountaintop. And yes, the journey wasn't easy. Yes, the journey is not going to be easy for anyone, but it's very worthwhile. God had directed Habakkuk through the dialogue there in the first chapter. He revealed his plans for disciplining Judah and destroying Babylon. He recorded at God's command the woeful digest justifying God's judgment on Babylon. And as you read the second chapter, the 5 woes, they're easy to understand. They're nothing simple. You'll see how God looks at those that are against his people, those that are his. Well, Habakkuk finally reaches that pinnacle. He reaches that highest point of praise in which God revealed himself in all power and all glory. So this doxology ends with Habakkuk's trust, his faith, placing it all on the Lord. As chapter 2, verse 4, the just shall live by faith. Some say his faith. It is God's faith which he gives to you. So the fear that Habakkuk had, the fear that we may have, will eventually turn to faith. So these days where we're living as, I will say, approaching the end of the age, a lot closer than many, many years before. I still think of Ecclesiastes 1:11, that there is nothing new under the sun. What has been, what has going, has already been. And nothing has changed, and nothing will change. As we see all the upheavals, I'll say in Europe, in China, the South China Sea, the disruptions and the problems that we're having here at home, those fears, these burdens, just like Habakkuk's, can be transformed to security, buoyed up with blessings. The just, the happy, the content, the victorious, yes, they will live by faith. As John writes in his first letter in chapter 5, verse 4, everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world. It is our faith. But it is the faith in God. Encamped along the hills of light, ye Christian soldiers, rise, and press the battle ere the night shall veil the glowing skies. Against the foe in veils below, let all our strength be hurled. Faith is the victory we know that overcomes the world. Our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus Christ, our righteousness. We dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ, the solid rock, we stand. All of the ground is sinking sand.